Hello, my name is Daniel Brown, and I wanted to spend a few moments talking to you and sharing some more deep background on the two videos that are on my channel. The one for Clokey Productions in 1964, the tour, and then the interview with Art Clokey in 1983. Well, like most of us, it all began with one of these. This is, of course, a Gumby doll, or as they were known back in the day as a Gumby Superflex puppet. Now, here's what it looked like in 1964. When they were $1 back in those days. What was interesting about the one that I got in 1964 was that on the back there was a coupon. And what it said was, learn how to make your own 3D movies with your Gumby Superflex puppet. Send 50 cents and plus postage and we'll show you how. So I was intrigued with that offer, so I cut out the coupon, signed it, filled it out, put my money on the back, I taped it to the back of the coupon, and then I sent it off to a P.O. box in West Covina. About a week later, I got this a little pamphlet in the mail, how to make your own 3D Gumby adventures with a Gumby Superflex puppet. It doesn't look like much, but inside was all this information about stop motion animation. If you wanted to be a stop motion animator, this pretty much taught you everything. They talked about armatures, they talked about a lot about moving the characters, they talked a little bit about sets, how to light the sets and things like that. About the only thing I really didn't get into was sound, which I guess for an 11-year-old that might be a little too ambitious. But everything else was in there. And on the back you'll see some illustrations. Here we see the use of a head gauge and how important that is to use a head gauge. Of course, those who are stop motion animators know how important a head gauge is to measuring the accuracy of your movement. Another picture here, here's Gumby. Actually, they're talking about using Gumby having him slide on one foot, as he does in so many of his movies. And when you're doing that, you don't want to move him more than an inch per frame, and you want to use your head gauge to judge the accuracy of your movement. Now, what I didn't realize until much later is that what Art was doing was basically seeding the next generation of stop-motion animators, because there was no information like this anywhere. Not in a library, not anywhere. You couldn't get it. Nowadays, of course, there's a lot of books on the topic, but back in 1964, that was about it. And so Art was really kind of seeding the next generation of animators with this pamphlet of his. Now, the only problem with my situation was that my camera did not have single frame. It was a little Kodak Brownie, an 8mm camera. In fact, it was the same camera my dad used to film that footage of Clokey Productions. And so I wrote a letter and I said, well, what do you do if your camera doesn't have a single frame release? How do you use it for animation? And oh, and by the way, I really enjoy the Gumby adventures. I love the art of clay animation. I'd love to tour your studio. So that was a time in my life when I was asking to see different things and so forth. So I thought, well, I'll ask them and see what happens. Most of the time I got blown off, but I thought, well, I'll try and see what happens. So I sent the letter off to the same P.O. box where I sent my coupon for that little pamphlet. About 3 weeks later, I get this letter back from Clokey Productions. And in the letter, the production director, Ray Peck, actually, Ray Peck wrote me a letter and explained how I could use my camera to do animation. And basically, basically you lock the camera down and you tap the shutter. Just tap the shutter, and sure enough, it worked. Now, here's a picture of Art with a Bell & Howell Filmo 70 60mm camera that did not have single frame. But if you notice behind the run button, there is this tall button behind it. And what that button does, I've only seen this in the flesh once. It's pretty clever. But what that button does is you press it and it taps the run button so that it takes just one picture. And so that apparently is how you make animation with a camera that doesn't have single frame. You just tap the run button and it works. So at the end of the letter, Ray said this. He said, "We're not now in production, but if you will call or write to us in about 4 months, we expect to be busy again, and we would at that time be glad to have you visit our studio." Raymond Peck. So there you are. There was my in to Clokey Productions. Now that was in late May when he wrote that letter. And well, about the end of August, the last week in August, I phoned up Clokey Productions. Their number's there on the letterhead. And who should answer the phone but Art Clokey? And I explained who I was in the letter and so forth. And he remembered me and the letter. So he said, well, we're going to be shooting next week. That'll be the first week of September. I think it was on a Thursday. And so he said, why don't you come out then and we'll show you how we do it, how we do the process of animation. And so I thanked him and I said, by the way, I said, are you the person that does the narration on the Gumby films? Because you know, some of the early Gumby adventures, you'll hear narration at the very beginning. And that's Art. And Art said, yeah, that's my voice. And so I said, I recognize your voice, is what I told him. And he got a big kick out of that. So we rang off. And so I told my dad, and my dad cleared his schedule for that day. And I invited a friend of mine who was really into monster films. He loved monster movies. He liked the Ray Harryhausen stuff. And I did too, but I really liked Gumby. I thought that the technique of clay animation was just, I'd never seen anything like it. I just thought that was just wonderful. So we went out there to Glendora on a Thursday, like I said, I believe. And that neighborhood where Clokey Productions was kind of a low-end industrial cul-de-sac. It was in 1964, and if you ever see any pictures of it, it's still a low-end industrial cul-de-sac. It hasn't changed much in all those decades. But the Clokey Productions, it's kind of a nondescript building. We went inside, and the lobby of the building, Clokey's, looks like the lobby you might find in a body shop, like you're waiting for your car to be fixed. But there was a front counter there, and we met Ruth, and we met Ray, and then Ray took us around back behind the partition. But you get into this, kind of more into the interior of the studio, and then all this whole kind of magical world kind of opens up. You see all these sets and props and characters and stuff from various Gumby adventures, and you go, oh, I remember that, I remember that. And it's pretty, it was just really kind of, like I said, it was kind of magical that way. Here's a picture of the shelves that were used in various Gumby films, but these are real shelves that they kept their props and sets on, and when they weren't using them for a movie. In fact, the room where the shelves are located is an actual workroom where they had machinery and equipment to actually make their sets and build props and so forth. In the room next to that was a room with nothing but clay. And they had these shelves of various colors of clay on it. And there was a work table, and then at the far end there were these two huge bins that had red and green clay. Art, I believe, said that there was a clay maker in Los Angeles that made this for them. And these were special colors that they had just for those characters, Gumby green and Pokey red. And there was a lot of it, so obviously they went through quite a bit of clay when they were making these Gumby adventures. Now, in some of the online articles, they talk about using a technique of melting the clay and pouring it into molds to make the Gumby puppets for the animation. Now, that was undoubtedly true later, but when I was there in '64, they weren't using that technique. What they were using was actually a form, kind of like this. It was made out of wood, and there was a dowel through the center. And what they would do is they would roll out the clay to the desired thickness, and then they would take this form, put it on top of the clay, and then cut around it. And they could make a bunch of Gumby bodies, and Pokey too. They had one for Pokey as well, using that technique. And then they would add the arms and so forth later. Now here's a picture of Gumby. This is from the lawn party. That's a still frame. And according to Ray, they used ping pong ball pieces for the eyes. They would cut those out, implant that into the clay, and then use a thin film of Vaseline on them, and then plant these, they were actually doll's eyes. You could buy them in a craft store. They're black plastic discs, and that's what they used for Gumby's eyes. Now here we see the set for the lawn party, and we see, in addition to Gumby and Pokey and the props, we see behind the set, we see a projector. And what that projector did was it projected the opening scene to the lawnmower sequence. It's projected into the mirror, and then that's projected back into the TV screen. And so Ray shot that all in one take. He didn't know, there was no double exposure, no optical printer, nothing like that. It was all done in one take. So Ray is animating the TV screen, he's animating the characters, he's animating the camera, he's moving the camera. So a very complex shot actually, but that's what he was doing that day. The cameras they used back then were a camera known as the Kodak Cine Special II, 16mm camera, and Kodak built those, I think they began in the late 40s, and continued that design till the late 60s, I believe, is when they stopped making those cameras. But the cameras really were beautifully engineered, beautifully designed. They were designed really for special effects. They had all kinds of special features on them. The Gumby Adventures, and this is something that many people may not realize, is that a lot of the Gumby Adventures were shot using double frames. Not every animation movement was done that way, but a lot of it was done that way. Whereby you have, instead of 24 frames, 24 movements, you have 24 frames, 12 movements. So each movement is double framed. And what that did was it speeded up the animation process while keeping it somewhat smooth, still keeping it somewhat smooth. The other thing they did was they shot the Gumby films, or animated them, I should say, in reverse. Most of the Gumby films in reverse. Now you can kind of see that in the scene where Ray is pulling back the camera. Now the actual shot itself is a dolly in, but we see that Ray is pulling the camera back, which indicates that he is doing that shot in reverse. And so that gives you some idea that they shot those in reverse. As that's what Ray said. Ray said they animated most of Gumby in reverse. Apparently that speeded up the process as well. I don't know how, but it did. The film they used was a film called Ektachrome Commercial. It was a 7255 and 7252 were the numbers on those films. And what they were was a low contrast, superfine grain color reversal film with a speed of 25. I actually bought a roll and tried it on some of my animation. And the film was not to be projected. It was designed to be either enlarged or copied. Now, Art did pull 6 Gumby Adventures, and he actually enlarged them to 35 so they could be theatrically distributed. And they looked pretty good. So that was Ektachrome Commercial, and that's what they used at that time. It was designed specifically for television production. Now, as we know, the Gumby Adventures were what we would call a mixed media film. They weren't like, say, the early Will Vinton films, which were, everything was clay. The characters were clay, the sets were clay, the props were clay. But with the Art Clokey films, they were mixed media. They were clay, they were rubber, they were wood, they were paper, they were cardboard, they were whatever was at hand that they could make their sets and props with. A material they used a lot of back in those days was called Celotex. And what Celotex was an insulating building material, very, very common use in the 60s and in the 50s. And it was a kind of a thick material that was easy to paint, easy to texturize. You could put props and sets on it, and it was pretty rigid. It could hold a considerable amount of weight. But it was somewhat spongy, kind of cardboardy, so you could poke wires through it, you could stick pins in it and so forth. So it was very, very versatile material, very easy to cut too. And so they used that extensively for the floors of their sets, the Gumby sets. Unfortunately, you can't get Celotex today because, as it turns out, it's full of asbestos. But back in the 60s, who knew that asbestos was a problem, you know? But you can't get it today, but that's what they used back in those days. Later on, after the tour of Clokey Productions, we went into Art's office, and here you see a picture of the Kachina dolls, the Kachinas, if you remember the Gumby Adventure, the Kachinas. Yeah, there's this kind of a split-screen shot where the Kachina dolls are flying past the camera. Well, in Art's office, those Kachina dolls were there. They were in his office on a shelf. And Art had commissioned a Native American artist to make those. And so that's what you saw there. And then, of course, the animators kind of worked with them to make them so they could be moved and bended and so forth. But along with that, there were dream catchers, there were arrowheads, Indian rugs, and so forth. A lot of kind of Native American paraphernalia in Art's office, and there were some other religious things there too that he had. And so it was kind of obvious. I didn't really think about it at the time, but it was pretty obvious that Art had pretty much left behind Christianity. As he said in his interview, that You see, he was always interested in the church, but it wasn't for him. So at some point he had lost his faith in Christianity and had pursued other religious thought, and was doing that even back in the early 60s. I'm sure that had a terrible effect on his marriage with his wife Ruth. Ruth was very much a dyed-in-the-wool church lady. She was very devout Lutheran, and Art had, of course, deviated from that. So I'm sure that had an effect on their marriage and an effect on the agreement that they had with the Lakeside Toys and with Gumby, which we'll get into a little bit later. In 1967, I went back to Clokey Productions, and they were right in the middle of creating a whole new batch of these films. And these were the films with a new theme song. If You Have a Heart, Gumby is a Part of You theme song. And that song was written and performed by a musician and animator by the name of Pete Kleinow. Now, Pete worked for Clokey Productions. Here you see him with, I think, Davy and Goliath, working on their films. And he was a very talented stop-motion animator. Worked on not only on Clokey's films, but he also worked on some feature films, such as RoboCop. But when he wasn't animating, he was also a studio musician, played the steel pedal guitar, and he also played dobro, and was very, very talented. We used in a lot of recording sessions. Linda Ronstadt used him, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. He was part of the Flying Burrito Brothers, so he was very, very well wanted in the recording industry for his work on the steel pedal guitar. But the interesting thing was, when I went there was no Art Clokey. Art Clokey was not there. And I asked Ruth about him, and she just was very vague about where he was. And so that was, so I didn't give it much of a thought. Then when I went back in 1970, where they actually offered me a job, they offered me a job creating timing sheets from the soundtrack for a whole new series of Davy and Goliath films they were making. And again, no Art. So I asked her where he was, and she just, Ruth was just very vague about it. She said that, he's off doing what he wanted to do, and she just said he didn't really say he wasn't a part of Gumby or anything like that, but that he just was otherwise occupied with something else. So I didn't, unfortunately, take the job, and so that was the end of it. I kind of like lost track of Art Clokey and Clokey Productions and Ruth and Ray Peck. Now in 1983, I was working for a national magazine at that time, working in their photographic department. And there was an article I'd seen in a magazine that basically had said that there was a revival of Gumby going on. And here was Art Clokey with his new wife, Gloria, and they were there, touring the country and showing Gumby adventures and so forth, and lecturing. And I thought, well, this would be a great story for a magazine. And I was working for, what's known as the AARP magazine at the time it was known as the Modern Attorney. And I talked to the editor, and I said, well, listen, I know this guy. I said, we can get an interview with him and, put this in the magazine. And so the editor said, well, go ahead, contact him and let's put together an interview. So I did. I was able to get a hold of his number, and he and Gloria were living in Topanga Canyon at the time. So I said, well, we'd like to do an interview. And he said, great. He remembered me, by the way, which is unusual. And so it was on a Wednesday. I remember that. I don't remember which Wednesday it was, but it was on a Wednesday about 1 o'clock. And so I drove out to Topanga Canyon, which is kind of like the kind of like a haven for A-frames. I mean, there's A-frames all over the place. And in fact, Art and Gloria had a real nice A-frame, huge place. And so I had my little Sony cassette recorder with me, and I asked Art if I could tape the interview, and he said yes. And so, I met him, met his wife, Gloria, very, very nice person, very nice lady, very sweet. And I also had my Yashica mat, 2 1/4 camera with me, because I was going to get a few pictures of Art and Gloria. And so we sat down and started the interview. I started asking Art a simple question, the origins of Gumby, which I knew he would know the answer to that immediately and probably had it rehearsed. He knew it so well. And so that started him going, and so that kind of eased in the interview process. As we went more and more into the interview, though, Art began to open up more. And in many ways, the interview was kind of took kind of a stream of consciousness approach, you know. But I did ask Art. I said at one point, I said, well, you know, Art, you know, I went back to Clokey Productions in 1967, and I went back again in 1970. And in both cases, you weren't there. And Ruth was very vague about what had happened to you. I said, what happened, you know? And so that's when Art opened up about this whole situation involving her and him and one of the lawyers with Lakeside Toys and so forth. And it was really a question of control about Gumby, Gumby's name and image. And you know, Art was much more protective of Gumby and Pokey. I mean, these were his creation, you know, much more so than he was with Davy and Goliath. Davy and Goliath was more Ruth's thing. You know, Davy and Goliath was financed by the Lutheran Church, and she was Lutheran, kind of a dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran. And, you know, she was more concerned about that. But she was not concerned about Gumby. She didn't mind Gumby's picture being used everywhere. So, you know, so it became a question of control. And eventually Art was forced to leave. And that's what he did. So, and that's what's on the tape there. In fact, when I was there in 1983, they were still in the process of getting back control of Gumby and Pokey. And as he said, he was still signing some more contracts with it. Of course, as we know, later on he did get control of Gumby and made the Gumby movie. But at that point, I turned the recorder off, which I shouldn't have done. Because I asked Art, I said, Art, what Gumby adventure has the most meaning for you? Of all the Gumby adventures you've made so far, according to 1983, which one has the most meaning? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, Sad King Ot's daughter was the one that had the most meaning for him. And the reason is because Sad King Ot's daughter was based upon, in part, upon a bedtime story that he used to tell his own daughter, Anne, and then he, of course, turned that into a script. But if you recall, in the Gumby adventure, there is the princess. The princess' name is Anne. Obviously, that's a reference to his own daughter. But he said that the film meant the most to him because it was, as he put it, he says it was a premonition of what was to happen to Anne, in his view. And if you recall in the Gumby adventure that the morph turns into an elephant, and Art, with his background in Hinduism, the elephant, as he put it, was the symbol of a new beginning. And in his view, Anne was going to have a new beginning. How and when at the time, he had no idea. He didn't really realize it at the time until later. So, and it's very touching, of course, in the film. You see the elephant speaking to Princess Anne. Of course, that's Art speaking to his daughter. Very, very touching scene, actually, it is, because Art's voice is the elephant. But in the end, the elephant rescues Anne from the Black Knight. But in Art's view, that was, you know, Anne basically having a new beginning somehow. And as it turned out, you know, sadly, she, of course, committed suicide, we know, in 1974. And but to Art, that meant for her a new beginning, and in some other different form, whatever it is he believed. But I was asking Art about, I didn't ask really about her suicide, but Art was pretty candid about it. In the some of the online articles about Anne, the few that exist, it talks about how she was traumatized because she saw a friend of hers get struck by lightning and was killed. And no doubt had a traumatic effect on her. But Art said that she was going through a real bad breakup with a boyfriend at the time, and it was something that she couldn't handle, and so she took her life. That's how Art put it. And so, you know, there's two different accounts of what prompted her suicide. That was Art's version. I wish I had it on tape. Unfortunately, I don't, so you'll have to take my word for it. Here we see some frames, some errant frames in the various Gumby adventures where the characters fell over, or there's the animator's hand. But if you recall, in the interview, Art said that he had to make the films at a certain price. In other words, they had to be made at a very low budget. And that meant no retakes. Or, for that matter, no optical effects. I mean, everything that was done in camera. and so you see that in these Gumby adventures. Or if it couldn't be done in camera, it was done either as a scratch on film or paint on film or something. You know, it was fire or smoke. It was done that way. But in a way, we kind of love the films because of that. There is a kind of simple, organic quality to the Gumby films that makes them just really charming and really a lot of fun to watch. In some respects, it kind of reminds you of the films of the Eastern European animators, like Carl Zeman and Yuri Trinka and some of the others, whose films were very, very well done, but they were very simple. I mean, in the sense that they didn't use a lot of fancy effects. Everything they had was probably done in camera, and they used ingenuity instead of high-end effects to accomplish what they wanted to do. And they kind of remind you of what Art and his crew did back in the 60s with the Gumby adventures. Well, I hope you enjoyed this background of Art Clokey and Clokey Productions and Gumby as I knew it back in the 60s and 70s. And if you have any feedback, let me know. I'm glad to hear it. But continue to enjoy the Gumby adventures and enjoy really what was the heart and soul of Art's creativity and Art's thinking, if you could put it that way, from that era of the 60s. And I appreciate you watching. Thank you.